My name is Ryan, and I am a front of house mix engineer, studio mix engineer, producer, sound editor. If it's audio, I'm probably involved. Call me what you want to call me. I am currently serving as the technical director for the Power Place Church, which is a church in Kennett Square, Pennsylvania. And I wanted to take a second and just share a video of myself kind of walking through a mix down of one of our worship services. I know in this crazy quarantine season that we're in, many of you are having to record your services and mix them down in post or broadcast your services for the first time. And I know that studio mixing can be very daunting. It's very much under a microscope compared to what live sound is, which is what many of you are probably used to in the church audio world. I wanted to just take a second and show you some basics, show you how I lay out a session, how I prepare a session for delivery, and my thought process behind it as a front of house mixer doing this in post. So the first thing I want to talk about is how I lay out my session. So before we get into any audio, before we get into any fun little EQ and compressor and effects and all that stuff, I just want to take a second and show you how I have everything kind of routed. So first up, these purple tracks are bass, red is drums, blue is band, and this green one is an AR room mic, audience response mic, if you don't know what that means. These pink tracks are the vocals, and then these gray tracks are all of my buses, which is just where all of these tracks kind of feed to. And these all have some EQ and compression to kind of glue the mix together here before it hits the final mix bus right here. I use 4 effect sends. You can see them here. They're these green tracks. And I don't always use all 4. I don't go crazy with effects. I know a lot of people love to use different reverbs on drums and they use on vocals and all this stuff. I kind of just have a short reverb, a really long reverb, a chorus with a little bit of distortion on it, and a delay that's kind of crazy sounding. I like the way that sounds, and I'm able to get results that I think are pretty good with just those 4 effects. So I'll show you my process for those shortly. So that's kind of the basic layout of the session. As far as plugins go, I know this is a big question for everybody. What plugins should I use when I'm mixing? And the reality is you can use anything. You can use the stuff that your DAW comes with and get fantastic results. I may do a video showing just that, maybe with a couple different DAWs using these same tracks just so we can compare. But for the most part, any plugins that you have, you should be able to use. If you have an equalizer and a compressor, you can mix. For me, I have been doing this for a while, so I have accumulated kind of a collection of plugins, and certain plugins are my go-tos. This is what I mix 99% of everything through and on. It is a SSL 4000 console channel strip. This particular one is made by Plugin Alliance. It's my favorite version of this plugin. Live, I use the Waves version because it's SoundGrid compatible, so you can use that inside your DAW as well. I know Slate Digital makes the FGS EQ and 401 FG 401 compressor for their virtual mix rack. I have those, use those as well. They're fantastic. I just like to use this one because it sounds good and everything's in one little plugin interface. The reality is, if you have an EQ and a compressor that comes with your DAW, you can use those plugins. After the SSL, the only other thing that is pretty constant in my template is the Arturia effects collection, which is a bunch of compressors and effects. I really love their compressors. I think that they sound the best of any emulation so far. And the reason I'm using that is because I have a Waves rig at front of house, and so all of my compressors from Waves are currently licensed on that computer. So if I want a DBX 160, I have to use a different plugin because I can't run 2 at the same time. So that's the only reason I'm using theirs. I happen to think theirs sounds a little better. All of my effects are from Slate Digital and Soundtoys. I use the Soundtoys Little Plate Reverb. I got this for free when they came out with it. They gave it out for free. I think it's like $50 now or something like that. It's not very expensive. And the Slate Digital repeater delay, I think sounds fantastic. I like an 1/8 note dotted and triplet quarter note stereo spread. I like it on the Cooper time cube setting. it's kind of chaotic sounding, so it adds a lot of energy without being super audible. You know, I don't like the sound of a delay where it's like, lift up a shout of praise, 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 praise. I don't really like that. I like it to just kind of be like, praise, if that makes sense, if that translates. You'll hear it when we get to vocals. For monitoring, I'm currently using my Beyerdynamic GT770s, and I use this SonarWorks reference software for studio monitor calibration as well as headphone calibration to make sure that I'm getting a flat and consistent response wherever I am. I will not mix without this. It has become essential to me as an audio engineer, and I can't recommend it enough. All right, so let's get started. The first thing I'm going to do when I am ready to mix down a session is I'm going to gain stage it. I'm going to make sure that everything is optimized from a level standpoint so that I'm not clipping or anything like that. If we play this session with all of our stuff at 0, no attenuation on anything, this is what we're going to get. So you can see some of the levels are super high. It looks like it's pretty much just the drums, but we're clipping. We're clipping our channels and we're clipping our converters. So we want to avoid that at all costs. Digital distortion is disgusting sounding and you don't want it to clip. So to gain stage this session, the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to mute my buses and I'm going to switch over to my edit window and I'm going to use clip gain in Pro Tools to kind of just set each audio track so that the input of everything is kind of hitting 35 to 45% of the meter on the way up. That's my starting point. Let's get started with the bass. Let's go, looks like we're at a big part. So I will unmute my bass here and we will start with the bass DI. So you can see it's a little hot. We'll just pull it down till it's right about there. And because these are duplicate tracks for my sends, these are 2 parallel sends I use on bass, all I'm going to do is just copy the audio down. With the exception of this trash track. I will get to that. I know it's clipping right now. I will get to that later. I like to keep that hot because I'm running into some distortion and I just want as much distortion as possible on that trash track. Let's move on to the kick drum mics. So you can see my kick in mic, super, super quiet. I don't need a lot of that at front of house. We have a pretty small space and I can usually even hear the kick drum in the room a little bit. So I don't need a ton of level on that guy. My kick out, it's a little hot. So I'll pull that guy down. I do this for every session that I'm doing, whether it's a worship mix down, it's a record I'm mixing. This is the first step for pretty much everything. Snare top, I'm gonna pull that guy down. I'm just trying to get something that's consistent. I'll copy that down to my trigger track, which I use Steven Slate trigger a lot to trigger drums. So we'll move on to the tom. Toms are a little hard sometimes to find because they're so infrequent. Looks good. Looks like we got some toms here. Looks good. Let's bring it back to that big part. Do these overheads. They're not too bad, but we'll bring it all down. So again, I'm aiming for that, 40% on the meter, maybe 50% on the loud parts. I just want to make sure I have enough headroom going to my master bus acoustic. Which doesn't look too bad. I'm going to leave that. The electric. Now this electric looks like it's a stereo track, but it looks like it's coming in mono. So I will give you guys a cool trick on how to do that, because we definitely want that to be in stereo. I think this was a week where we had 2 guitar players and we were only using 1 on our broadcast. Keys are coming in hot. We've got a loop. Looks pretty good. How about this big part? Looks good. We've got a pad. So this is a pretty standard worship setup. I think it's just guitars, bass, drums, keys, and some tracks with 2 singers. I think this is representative of what most of you guys are probably working with. It's definitely not a huge setup. We're a church of about 300 people, and we are able to get pretty good results. All right, lastly, we've got this little sample pad, and we've got the vocals. I'm going to leave the sample pad as is for now. These AR mics are not bad. I did pre-process that one, it looks like. I brought up the right side about 12 dB. It was quieter. I think we were having problems with that mic cable that day. These 2 singers. So this vocal looks like it's a little hot. Let me make sure I get rid of any of these processors. Yeah. Looks like these guys were still set. Because I'm going to be doing this completely from scratch and in real time, so you guys can kind of see how I would do it. All right, so we've gone through, and this last track, mic 2, we've gain staged it to where it looks good. You can see every track is coming in about the same, with the exception of this trash track that we will get to. And so that is gain staging a session. Everything at that point is going to flow into our buses and into our master bus at a healthy level. And we're not going to be clipping, and we are in control of the final output level and not the audio file itself. All right, so let's move on to some drums. I've moved my mix bus over here just so that I can watch the levels as we do this. The first thing I do in any mix, especially worship, is I get a good drum sound, because I think the drums are such a good backbone to start with in this genre. If you can get the drum sounding good, you can usually fit everything else around it. So the first thing I do is I mute all my buses, make sure that my drum bus is unmuted. I'll mute all my tracks, and I'll start on my kick-in mic. So let's get a good sound out of this guy. Here it is. You can hear it's kind of cardboard sounding, cardboardy. It's not very good. It's a tom mic actually inside of the kick drum, because we don't have a good kick in mic yet. We were using a D6 on the out, on the kick out mic, but the actual kick in mic is a tom mic. So it's not the best sounding for that application. There's a lot of that 900 area I'm going to pull out. Right off the bat, I'm going to start high passing it, and I'm going to gate it. I'm going to use a fast attack and a fast release. You want that gate opening as quickly as possible on a transient source like a drum. I'm going to try and get some snap out of it. And I'm going to high pass it as well, or low pass it. So that's before. And that's after. A little bit better. I think we can still get some more snap out of it. Normally you would find that snap around 4 or 5K, but for this particular mic, I'm gonna go higher. And don't be afraid to do drastic EQ moves, especially on this. I'm using a tom mic, so I'm gonna need to do some work to get it sounding the way I want. I'm going to follow it up with some compression. I'm gonna do fast attack, quick release. I think that sounds pretty good compared to what we started with, which was kind of this nasty sounding cardboardy thing. So you can see we've added a bunch of level, and now we are clipping our mix bus at times. So I'm going to bring this fader down, and this is what I do to set my levels. Real quick, I'm going to pull some of that 500 area out as well. Sounds a little better to me. I like to set the level with this fader in my console strip. You can do this in Pro Tools, so the concept applies. Just think of this as my Pro Tools fader. But I like to set it so that my peak is kind of right along the lines of this fader at Unity, and then I will balance everything to where that's peaking. So you can see some of these louder hits, it's going above. That lets me know I'm going to need some more compression on this kick drum. It's a little bit dynamic. I think for worship especially, the sound that is in is just very aggressive, very fat, and kind of in your face. So I want to make sure that this kick drum's pretty even so that I can balance things around it and it's not too dynamic. So to do that, I've already maxed out my threshold, so I'm going to increase my input gain. So I'm getting more compression. I'm going to slow the release a little bit. I'm going to bring down my output a little because I just increased my input. And that looks a little bit better. Now we're pretty much consistent with where I want to be peaking. So let's move on to this kick out mic. First thing I'm going to do is kind of clean up a little bit of the low end. We'll go with around 30. I'm going to give it some punch, around 50. So that's pretty aggressive. I'm also going to gate it. Again, fast attack, fast release for the drums. I'm going to turn my gate off for a second just so I can hear the tone of the drum a little bit better. There's a lot of that 200 area. I'm going to scoop some of that out. I want it to be super punchy. I'm going to low pass that, get some of the cymbals out. Add some compression again. I like to use 4:1. I'll go slow attack, quick release on the kick out mic. I want the transient of that low end to come through. So I need a little bit more input. wondering why I wasn't doing anything. That is something that you will have happen to you all the time. My dynamics are off because I turned the gate off. So slow attack, fast release. I like to use 4-to-1 on my ratio. Bring this guy down till I see about 3 dB. I'll push the input till I'm seeing 6 on the very loudest hits. And then I'll blend that in as well so that we are at about the same level as our kick in mic. So I know that the kick out and the kick in are peaking at about the same level. And now tonally, I will balance the kick in with the kick out. Not too bad. I don't hear a lot of cardboardy sound in that kick out mic. Get rid of a little bit of that. Sounds good to me. I'll move on. All right, so for the snare, typically I will replace my snare top mic. We are using it's a good snare. It's tuned well. And we're using a 57 on the top and bottom. They're my go-to for snare mics. But it's just in a very, very small space in a drum shield with no treatment kind of behind it or around it. So it just sounds really cardboardy in that environment. And we can get a good sound live, but it just doesn't record well, if that makes sense. So I usually will replace my drums with Steven Slate Trigger. I will let you hear the snare drum. So you can really hear it's not the most pleasant sound. It is usable. So I would filter out around 100. Pull out some of that 300. Pull out some 700. Add some highs, low pass it a little bit. Add some lows, compress it. And then again, use that gate. Get rid of that cymbal bleed. So you can hear the high end and the upper mid isn't super pleasing on this drum. So it's usable, but you can just get a way better sound faster using sample replacement on the top snare, on the louder hits, and then blending that with the bottom snare mic. That will give you a much more natural sounding sample replacement, and it's going to give you a way better sounding snare in the mix. So let's move on to that. For the actual triggering itself, I use Steven Slate Trigger and samples from That Sound. I love their samples. Can't say enough good things about those guys. And I use the Paul Maybury library, and I use his Smack Beauty, which I'm guessing stands for Black Beauty, processed aggressively, which is just a great snare drum for big, aggressive rock sounds. I use this dry sample, and I use this wet sample. So they're the same drum, the same sample, processed two different ways. And I blend them together, and together they sound like this. So you get a really nice, clean fundamental in the low end, and a nice, open, consistent, big, high end every single hit. To process those, I will, again, run it through my SSL channel strip. And we'll start by just kind of messing with the way it sounds in context with the kick drum. Get rid of some lows. It's already really consistent, but I will normally add a compression to just about everything, just a little bit. I'm going to match the levels because it's definitely loud. So that looks pretty good. I might bring it up and compress it a little bit more. Maybe a little bit less. All right, looks good from there. So let's process this bad boy and see what we can get it to sound like. Get a nice high end out of a sample. Might take some 700 out. I like my snares to be on the lower side. I made it pre-dynamics, so the compressor's reacting to all that low end, and I'll rebalance that again. Right around there seems good to me. Again, I'm watching that master meter. I don't want to add things and see the level start jumping drastically. I want to keep the level that's the kick and snare are peaking relatively consistent. And then if the snare is poking out way more, then I know it needs more compression or the kick is too compressed. So that sounds pretty good. Let's move on to this snare bottom mic. With the sample, sounds like this. There's a lot of cardboard. Kind of that area. I'll gate this as well. made it pre-dynamics again. I want that gate reacting to the boost that I just did. And I'll compress it as well. I'll use a fast attack on the bottom. And then blend that in. And then let's see what those kick and snares sound like if I get rid of the SSL processing. So that's with it. Here's without it. And here's without the sample and the original snare. Super cardboardy and gross. Here's the processing on everything, the kick in, kick out, the original snare drum and the snare bottom. Here's them together without the sample. So it's usable, but here it is with the sample engaged. It's just way bigger, way clearer, way cleaner. So we'll keep that good. We are starting to peak a little bit more on the master bus, and I'll take care of that. Some of the louder hits with the actual drum bus itself. I don't want to do too much compression on the actual shells themselves. I would much rather do it on the bus level. So let's get some toms going. I believe let's listen to the overheads. I believe we are in drummer's perspective. I guess we should probably find some toms. That might help. Looks like there's some toms here. No, we are actually in audience perspective. So we have two options. We can pan the toms, audience perspective, or we can flip the overheads so that it is drummer's perspective. I am going to just match what I just heard. So I like to do 40 and 80 for my toms. I'm using 2 toms here. If I had 3, I'd probably do like 40, 40, and 80. I just feel like that gives a good ratio. So let's add these toms in. Let's start with the rack. Not a terrible tom sound to start. Gate that. Get rid of that 600. Maybe add some 4 or 5. Low pass it a bit. Maybe a little higher, maybe 8. So I backed off the compression a bit, sounds a little better. I'm just gonna find where that fundamental is. Sounds like it's around 200. See if we can get a little lower, like 120. Yeah, that sounds better. So I'll leave that and we'll blend that guy in as well. Looks pretty good. Now I do notice that snare bottom needs a little bit less on the gate. So you can hear it's not doing too much. It's super light, so I'll opt to have it a little higher for the clarity that it'll gain me, or for the clarity that I'll gain in the bigger sections. And then I'm just going to copy this Tom 1 setting to Tom 2 and just see if I can lower the fundamental a little bit. A little bit of cardboardy stuff. Right around 700. Cool. Added a little bit of 6K to bring some attack out. Still hear a little bit of that cardboardiness. I'm going to see if I can find it. I think it's around 900. I like it. All right, they sound pretty even to me now. I slowed down the attack time on the compressor to little bit more of the punch through. All right, let's try these. Well, let's blend those in a little bit. So it looks like we are peaking. That's good. Add these overheads, and you'll notice I'm blending in the next drum with the old drums or the other tracks not muted. So I'm trying to make these sound cohesive as a unit, and not just make each drum sound huge. They need to sound good together. So it looks like now that I'm seeing it, that floor tom is peaking a little bit more than I want, so I will quicken the attack time. Maybe higher ratio. Looks good. Back to these overheads. Hear the snare come in. If I mute it, my level doesn't jump too bad. Let's find that. there's a lot of that like 900 mid-range area in these drum tracks from that small room that we're basically putting them in with no treatment. So you're getting a quick reflection off the wall in that area, and it just doesn't sound too pleasant to me. I think I'm going to pull it out on this guy up here, this higher band, so that I can grab some of these lower mids. Pull them out a little bit, and then I'm going to roll off some lows, clean that up. See if I can add some air. And then compress these guys a little bit. I like fast attack, fast release. And I barely hit the compressor on this guy for the overheads. All right, that sounds good to me. I'm not even going to do anything with the hi-hat right now. I usually don't have a problem hearing the hi-hat and the overheads. If you need to use your hi-hat, my tips would be boost the high end on it, roll off all the low end, and then only bring it in sections where you need the definition, and then keep it out for the other sections. Or use it creatively. Distort the crap out of it and use it as a room mic that's really close to the drums. Sometimes that can sound cool, and experiment with things. So that does it for the drum instruments themselves. Let's move on to the drum bus. So for the drum bus, I'm going to move my mix bus back over so I can see it. I like to just make sure that my drums aren't too dynamic and just do some general compression on them. I will do a slow attack, fast release on my bus. I don't want to kill the transients too much. Pretty normal for me. It's just kind of moving in time. Without it, you can see I'm peaking on the louder spot. I'll use a little bit less. But that kind of just reins everything in a bit and keeps the level more consistent. So that's my drum bus. And then the next thing I like to do is I have a kick and snare bus that I'll process separately. So here is the kick and snare bus. So I send just the kick and snare. You can see it here and here at unity gain, or not unity gain. Currently I'm sending it pretty cranked. Let's back those down. I'll show you why I had those up, because this is a template that I use. What we'll do is we'll open up the compressor that I like to use, and we'll unmute this kick send that's currently at Unity. What we can do is do let's do 6-to-1, because this is in parallel. I like the auto attack and release. I like it to be kind of slamming the compressor. So I'm doing about 5 dB of reduction. You'll see that the auto attack and release, it's kind of pumping back to 0 in time. So I will mute the kick send, and now I'll do the snare. You can see I'm doing about the same amount of compression. When I put them together, it kind of goes a little bit further than I want right now. I want to hit that 5 dB mark. That's where I think this compressor sounds the best. Can you hear how aggressive that is? And I might add a little bit more highs to that kick drum. I like the way it kind of punches on that compressor. It's just super aggressive sounding to me. And then I will add that makeup gain. Then you can see I have a trim plugin doing about 10 dB of trimming on that bus because I want to be able to blend the fader up to an area that is usable and not have to keep everything way down here for parallel stuff where I have no resolution. So here is the drums, and I'll blend the kick snare bus in. So without it, here's with it. Keeps everything super fat and in your face, but the level didn't jump up as much. So I'm increasing the RMS level. Here's without it. And then let's put it back in when they kind of get going. You can hear how much more articulate the transient is on that kick. I like that. And then in addition to that, I will also make this pre-fader so we can hear it, but I also do a whole parallel send on drums. So this is just a duplicate off the drum bus sending to this guy, which is an SSL bus compressor. And I like to, for this track, we'll go aggressive. Fastest attack, fastest release, or slowest attack, fastest release. I just want that wash that comes up with that compressor. And I'll blend that as well with the kick snare bus and the drum bus. There's without it. There's with it. You can see our level's not peaking any louder, but we get a much bigger sound out of the cymbals. All right, I like that. So that is how I process my drums. From there, let's move on to the bass. All right, so for bass, I have a couple of things that I do. Let me move my mix bus back over here so we can see it. Unmute my bass bus, and I'm going to leave my drums unmuted for now because I want to build off of what I did on those drums. and not get confused by making my bass sound really good in solo. I want to be able to hear it in context. So here is our bass DI. Increase my input gain on this channel strip, lower my fader, increase the distortion. So this DI does not sound bad. We're using radial DI on it, and it does not sound bad by itself. That is straight off of a Rickenbacker, and if that's what the Rick sounds like. It sounds like a great bass. I will, for this track, I'll filter out like 30 hertz. I'll filter out some of the top end as well. I don't need all of that high end on a bass, and I might do some gentle compression on it. Just to kind of ride it. Now, I pulled out a ton of that 700, 800, 900, 1K kind of area in the drums. So I'm going to add a broad EQ boost around there on my bass. That's going to help my bass poke out a little bit on a smaller speaker and blend with the drums and not take over that area. I'm going to essentially fill the hole that I made with the bass. And I'm going to add a little bit of 300 as well. That kind of fills out the bass. Here's without the EQ. Here's with it. And again, when I hit this mute, I'm watching the peak to make sure it doesn't get any louder. So I feel like that sounds pretty balanced to my ears on these headphones, and I'm confirming that I'm not adding a bunch of level to my mix. I want my kick and snare to kind of be the peak of my mix so that when I put my mix bus compression on, it sounds good and it glues everything together the way that I want it to happen. So from there, I'm going to add a parallel compressed low track, and this is where I'm going to get my sub lows from. I want them to be fairly consistent, so I will take a EQ that's linear phase so it doesn't mess with the phase, and I will filter out 120 and above, and I will compress this pretty aggressively. I'm going to increase my input gain. And I'm going to do a pretty big boost these lows. We'll do like 150 and below. And I will also filter out about 38 hertz because I'm bringing all that up. And I'll bring this fader up and you'll hear all the weight come from that. That keeps my low end really fat and in your face the whole time. I mean, I'm doing 10 dB of compression on it right now. It sounds fat. what I'm going to do next is I like it loud. I think most people like the bass sub a little loud, but I don't want to compete with the kick. So what I'm going to do is I've sent my my kick to bus 1, and what I want to do is I have a compressor. Right now it's on my bass bus, but I'm going to put that on my actual subs. And that is set to key input bus 1. And what this is going to do is it's going to compress my sub bass when the kick hits. So I'm not affecting my whole bass and turning the whole bass down when the kick hits. I'm only turning that sub channel down when the kick hits. So the rest of my bass still stays loud enough. So if all the upper harmonics and stuff like that stay the same. So if I were to boost this, here's without it, here's with it. Without it. Listen to the low end on the kick drum. It'll pop through. And I don't lose the bass because I'm only affecting that sub-low region. And then next, I will show you this trash channel. So I use a linear phase EQ again. I get rid of, it's set to 52.8 right now. You can kind of set it anywhere in that sub area. I just want to filter out the very, 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 very lows of this track. I don't need them. They're kind of coming from this sub low track. And then the next thing I'll do is I use this plugin from Soundtoys called Radiator. It's an Altec mic mixer, mic preamp, summing mixer type box. I actually had a buddy who had a real one, which was so cool. It sounded amazing. It's from the 60s and it just sounds amazing. What I like to do with this plugin is, as you can see, everything is set to stun. The bass is all the way up, the treble is all the way up, the input gain's all the way up, the output gain's all the way up, and the mix is 100% wet. I'm destroying this bass with this plugin, and that's why you see the level clipping so bad, because these are gain stages. I'm adding about 30 dB of distorted gain to this track. So I have the ability to gain stage with this SSL strip into this distortion, and I put another one after to be able to gain stage after it. So this is where I'll get my level from. And if I mute these guys, you'll be able to hear what this sounds like. Let me get a level that's good with that. This is what that track just sounds like, just running through it, set to stun. It's super aggressive. What I have the ability to do is get even more by pushing into that plugin. So hear how much high end I got. So that's without all that gain boost into the distortion. Here's boosting into it. So absolutely no dynamics, but I have a very wide band saturation. It's full frequency. So then I'll use this SSL strip to kind of shape it. I'll take a little bit of the top end off. And I'll blend it in. Let's add some some of that 900 that we took out of the drums. Let's see, my compressor is reacting a little bit, about 3 dB constantly. CPU error overload. So we added a bunch of that 900 area again that we took out of the drums, and we're filling that hole with the bass. We're making them work well together. We've got the kick and sub bass working well, and now we're getting the mid-range of the bass to poke through where we scooped out the drums. So I'm going to blend this trash track in with our regular DI and sub bass. Maybe change the blend a little bit and see what it sounds like. Somewhere around there sounds good to me. Again, watching our levels, we're not clipping, we're not adding a ton of gain. We have nice headroom, it's nice and even. Our dynamic range, you'll notice, is not huge, which is a good thing. Too much dynamic range can make your mix sound really quiet compared to everything else. Loudness is built in the mix, not in the limiter. So without width, really just brings the energy and the aggression to everything. And I'm gonna go ahead and add a little bit more of that room sample in trigger. So my snare has a little bit more life to it. All right, so that is how I process the bass inputs. But let's talk about the bus itself. So just like I process the drum inputs and then process the bus, I do that for the bass as well. I do that for everything. And I get it gelling together with my buses. It sounds the way I want with my tracks, and then I get it to gel with my buses. And then if I was live on like a front of house console, I would take VCAs off of these buses and then mix with those. So I'm not affecting the pre-compression, like the pre-compression ratios. I don't like to mix into compression. I like to mix post-compression. So I like to use an LA2A on my bass. Currently one on there. It might be working already. A little bit. So I'll typically get my bass to be about a dB. So I got a lot fatter. And it pushes it back to blend with the drums. I'm gonna go a little bit less. I am going to go into this bass track, and because I have so much distortion on it, I'm going to find a spot where their bass isn't really playing. Let's try the beginning. You can hear there is some noise, hiss, and stuff from the actual distortion just being cranked. It's distorting and bringing up all that noise. So I'm just going to put an expander on it. just get rid of some of that level. And you know what? I'm going to do that on the other SSL channel strip, which is the one on the trash track before the distortion. It's nice and quiet. When he's not playing. When there is signal, I want it to come through. So when he's hitting his headstock a little bit, it sounds like there at the beginning. I do want some of that grit to come out and be audible. And I'll typically ride the trash track throughout a mix anyway. So in an intro, you might not want a bunch of that distortion. So that's kind of where we'll use our ears to kind of blend that in. So that is our bass and drums gelling, showing the bus processing, the distortion, the parallel sub, the parallel compression on the drums, the kick and snare bus that adds a lot of attack and snap to it. That's how I would process those guys. Let's move on to the band. So for the band, let's start with the guitar bus. So for this guitar, for this guitar bus, I should say, we have an acoustic guitar going through it and an electric guitar. We have a single electric guitar. So what I'm going to do on this guy, let's mute the acoustic and let's listen to this electric. So it's the exact same thing. It sounds super flat because it's in mono. So you can fake stereo by putting on a delay, 100% wet on each side. This is just the stock delay in Pro Tools. And I'm going to put, let's do 34 milliseconds of delay on the left side and 0 milliseconds of delay on the right side. And what that's going to do when I engage it is it's going to delay the arrival of the signal in your left ear and your right ear by 34 milliseconds. And what that does is actually tricks your brain into thinking it's coming from two spaces. It's not the greatest sound because it still is mono. So it's not true stereo, but it definitely sounds better than just running it straight mono. So here it is without it, and it'll sound mono. And here I'll engage it. You'll hear it spread out. So that drastically helps just get that acoustic or that electric out of the way of the snare drum, the kick drum, and the vocal and the bass. So let's mess with this guy. So what I like to do for guitars is the first thing I do is filter out some of that low end. It's very important that your guitars are not full of low end because it will suck up headroom in your mix. Electric guitars don't produce a lot of usable content down there anyway. And if they do, it's mud. So what I will do is I will compress these a little bit. Now, electric guitar is pretty compressed anyway, but I want to compress it just to even out any of the peaks that might be in the waveform. I'm going to add high end to this guitar because it sounds really dull to me. I'm going to low pass it to get rid of some of the sizzle. And then I'm going to cut some of this muddiness. a shelf from like 400 and below up, and then increase this filter. So here's without the EQ. Here's with it. Might add a little bit of 4K. And then let's blend this into the mix. Again, watching our master meters to make sure we're not adding a ton of volume and tricking ourselves. So let's go to a section of the song where they are nice and big. Get this plugin out of my way for a second. Hear how nice and aggressive that sounds. Without the EQ, it sounds flat. You don't normally want to brighten up guitars too much, and you don't want to over EQ guitars in general, because you'll start messing with the phase, especially if they're stereo. But this particular guitar just sounded really dull to me. So I added 10.6 dB at 12.8 kilohertz with a bell shape. That's pretty uncommon for me to do that, but it's an example of that's what that sound needed. So don't be afraid to crank knobs and stuff and over compress or over boost. That's why it goes to plus 15, is because sometimes things need that much. That's corrective EQ for me right there. I was correcting the source. Might add a little bit more of that bass distortion. And because I filtered out the guitars because they were a little muddy, I'm going to add a little bit of that low frequency that I lost on the distortion. So I flipped the phase. So I flipped the phase and it seemed to give me the low end I wanted. Sometimes with a source like the bass, how I'm multing it, the phasing, even though I'm using a linear phase EQ, I'm not losing low end, but it's shifting kind of how it interacts. It's shifting some of the sub lows out and giving me more of those low mids, which is what I wanted to fill the space that I took out on the guitars. I'm replacing that with those low mids, and flipping the phase worked. So your phase button is something you want to check and use your ears. It's helping in this case, so I'm going to use that. I don't need to boost the low end. I'm going to keep the phase flipped. When I did flip it, it shifted a little bit of that 5K area. So I boosted that with a belt, and the way that that interacted seemed to bring it back to me. So now I've got the best of both worlds. So that's working, and then I'll move on to my bus. What I like to do for guitars is I like to use a Fairchild or a mid-side compressor. This Fairchild has a mid-side mode, and I really like the way it sounds. It adds a lot of grit to the guitars. I will turn the stereo link off, and I will compress the mids about a dB, and then boost the output gain on the sides without compressing. And what that does is it kind of widens them and gets them out of the way of the middle channel, which lets me put a vocal in there, lets me get my kick and snare and kind of punching right there without the guitars stepping on their toes in that region. There's it off. Listen for it to go wide. And listen to the snare. It all of a sudden has its own space that it didn't have before. It's kind of masking each other. Now they're together. So that's a quick trick. I'll do that on keys, guitars, tracks, anything that's stereo, sometimes even my effects, because it lets me punch through with the vocal, kick, and snare without fighting, without a bunch of drastic EQ that kind of messes with the fades of everything. So let's add this acoustic in. This is an acoustic DI. Filter the low end out. Give it some sparkle. Before I give it some sparkle, I'm going to kind of get rid of some of the muddiness. It. I'm going to use a fast attack and fast release. I want this thing, or I'm going to slow down the release actually, so it's moving in time. Get rid of some of that mid-range. Acoustic DIs are tough if you're not using some really expensive systems. They kind of just sound like DIs. So you have to kind of use them as shakers. So they're working together. It feels good. It's not too mid-rangey and distracting. So from there, I'm going to add the keys. So let's move on to keys. And actually, before we do that, let's take a look at this compressor, because what this guy will do is even out the guitar, the acoustic, and electric. It will make them work together as a rhythmic unit. hear how if you listen, the acoustic on some of its louder strums will poke above the electric. With this compressor in, it's going to kind of rein in the peaks of both signals and gel them together as a unit. So I like the way that sounds, and because I'm not adding a bunch of makeup gain with the compressor, I'm just clamping down those peaks, I'm lowering our dynamic range and preserving our headroom, so we're still looking good on our master bus. We're not clipping, we're not adding level, we're just getting rid of those peaks that are a little bit too much. So let's move on to the keys. So for keys, it's very important that you limit the bandwidth in places that it is conflicting with things. Keys are one of those things that, especially we're using a Nord, so it's especially full bandwidth. It's sample based, and it seems like a lot of manufacturers try to get the biggest, loudest, fullest sounding samples for their keyboard. So there's a lot of low end, there's a lot of low mids, there's a lot of mids, there's a lot of high mids, and there's a lot of highs, which is great as an audio engineer because we get to shape the sound. But from a frequency standpoint, that's not great because it's going to conflict with everything. So let's take a listen to how these keys sound. I'll unmute my keys bus, and we should be able to blend these guys in and see what we're working with. So I unmuted it and it sounded terrible, and it's because there's this pad going through that bus as well. So let me mute that, and we'll get to that in a second. So right off the bat, it's not a bad sound. Super dynamic. It's a little bit heavy in the mid-range to me. I want to shift that a little bit to the top end to make room for my vocal. It sounds good in the mid-range, and this is one of those things. It sounds really full. So to my ears, it sounds good. So I'm hesitant to cut those mids. But I'm thinking, how am I going to fit this key in with my vocal? And the vocal is all about the mid-range. It's all about kind of that 1K to 5K. That's where the clarity is going to come from. And right now, if I just do a broad boost there in the keys, that's where I'm hearing a lot of tone. It sounds good in that area, but I want to cut that and make a little bit of room for my vocal and shift our attention to these highs. And I'm going to check right now where I boosted my electric. So I corrected that at about 12K. So I'm going to try and go a little bit higher with my keys. I'm using a bell to start with. I like the bell over the shelf on these SSLs because I feel like the shelf is super aggressive. I know that when you boost a shelf on an SSL at like 8K, it's actually starts there, but it's a very wide Q. So it touches down at like 1K is where it starts really. So it's very broad, which is good for some things. But I prefer to use the bell because it's a bit more precise. So you'll hear how, I'm going to filter out these lows too. you'll hear how we shifted the direction of, or we shifted the attention from the mid range to the high end. So here's without the EQ. Here's with it. Without it. Listen to the guitars. They're masking the guitars here. And there they all kind of separate. So I'm going to link my compressor so that my stereo image is being compressed at the same time. I don't want, when they go down and they hit the low notes on the left side really aggressively, I don't want the left side being triggered by that low end and the right side not. When you link stereo link compressors, that's what it's doing. It's saying, okay, we're going to sum the two channels into mono for the detector of the compressor and react that way. So if he slams the low keys on the left side, it's going to also compress the right keys at the same time, which helps it just feel a bit more even. I'm going to use a fast attack on keyboards. They can be super transient. So I want to kill that transient, and then I'm going to time the release to the music and probably do 3 to 6 dB of reduction on it. That sounds great to me. I'm going to leave the low pass where it is. I want that high end. And then for my keys as well, I like to use that 1176 by Arturia, and I like to just even it out a little bit more. This adds a little bit of distortion on the fast attack, fast release setting, which helps the keys cut through. Nice and even, and then I'll do the exact same thing I did on the guitars with this Fairchild compressor. Adds a little bit more grit, a little bit more distortion, and I will compress the mid channel a dB and then boost the side a dB. So it kind of forms a wall of sound between the electric and the keys that I really, really like for this style of worship. This is an Elevation worship song, and a lot of the stuff by Elevation and Hillsong and Bethel is really aggressive sounding, or aggressive sounds work well with that that style of worship music. I wouldn't do this on something that's a bit more traditional sounding, more acoustic sounding. But I love how the wall of sound, aggressive sound works with a song like this. So let's move on to this pad. So pads are one of the things in worship music that you usually have on for the whole song, and you use them for transition moments. They, quite frankly, they stay on most of the service for most of us, and we kind of ride them in and out. They're very full range a lot of the time. At least the ones we use are. We made these ones ourselves, me and the keys player, to make sure that it was super full range. So we have a sub octave in there. We've got a high octave in there. And you can kind of filter out whatever you need. So if it's an intro, you can get rid of all the highs and you have a big sub pad. If it's fitting in a mix, you can filter out all the lows and you have a nice shimmery pad, that kind of thing. So let's take a listen to this pad and let's see what it sounds like. And when we blend it in with our mix, what is it covering up? What is it taking over? And where might we need to filter it? So it's very full sounding. It's got a lot of low mids, and I want to accentuate some of the shimmery stuff in there. So the first thing I'm going to do is I don't really need to compress this. It's been compressed. It's a pad. It's a sustaining source. But what I will do is I'll do a fast attack compression. I'll link the stereo image, and I'll just tickle this 3 dB light. And I might do that with a infinity to 1 ratio. Just so I am kind of effectively peak limiting it. So if there are any surges or peaks in the low end, they're getting evened out and they're not going to kill some headroom that I'm going to have. I'm going to cut the low end at about 150 hertz. I don't feel like I need any of that right now. I've got plenty of low end in the bass and the snare and the kick and the toms and the keys. What I hear is a lot of this. I'm going to pull that out and I'm going to mute this track, or I'm going to take the EQ off. Put it in. Let me mute the track. Unmute it. So it's still adding a lot of energy. It adds a lot of fullness. I'm going to take a shelf from 450 and bring that down about 3.5. I don't want a ton of low mids in this pad. And I'm going to use a shelf instead of a bell on the highs. Wrong. I'm going to use a bell at plus 15 dB at 7K. I think that sounds good. Here's without the EQ. Here's with it. I'll mute the pad. Bring it down just a little. Low pass it a bit too. About 10K. I want those guitars to poke through a bit more there. And those are going through my keys bus, so they are hitting this Fairchild and getting widened. When I'm listening, I'm hearing them interact with my guitars in a way I don't like. So I'm going to take a narrow cut. I know I boosted my guitars at about 4K. So I'm going to try cutting that at a narrow Q to see if that kind of lets my guitars poke out a little bit more. Just tweaking the EQ. So now I feel like my guitars are coming through again. And everything sounds nice and full. I want to keep this mid-range nice and full. It's going to help keep the vocal from sounding like it's too loud. A lot of times on live streams, the vocal sounds super loud, even though it's not. It's just that the band doesn't have a ton of mid-range because it's all been cut out. So when you're doing like an aux mix for your stream, right off of your, a post-fader aux mix, you've cut all these lows and these low mids on your inputs for your room. And a lot of times what happens is your mix will sound really kind of scooped and flat and lifeless. So that is the key bus with our keys and pad. Let's move on to our track bus.
Your tracks bus is whatever you're using from Ableton or Multitracks, just to get extra content into your PA system that you don't have either musicians for, inputs for, whatever the reason is. Most of us are using a tracks bus when we're mixing. And so for me, I've kind of gone ahead and kind of looked at this because this tracks bus that we are using has a lot of stuff in it that I don't want. So there's a guitar that comes in right here. You can see I deleted it. I don't need it. I have this guitar. I don't need to double it up. And right in here, there's this weird percussion track that is conflicting with my drums, that it's too loud. There was no balance done to these stems. So the pads and strings sound beautiful, and then some other instrument comes in and it's way too loud. So I'm only utilizing this for these sections where there's kind of just sustain and everything else is muted. So this is what it sounds like. I've also muted the bass distortion because we're in a softer section of the song. So you can hear it's a nice airy sounding track. I've cranked the high end and I've done some aggressive filtering. If you look, here's without the EQ. Here's with it. Let's go to where the strings are pretty active. Here's without the EQ. Here's with it. And I'm really doing that to try and just pull the strings out because they're not balanced well in this stem. I'm also doing that mono to stereo delay trick that I showed you on the guitar. I'm doing 43 milliseconds of delay on the right side because we delayed our guitar on the left side. So I don't want them to be conflicting. I want them to be different to our ears. Here is what those tracks sound like, muted and then unmuted. So they're just in there really to be that super, super top end of the mix. And that's really it. That's all I want from them. That's about all this particular stem track is good for. All right, so let's move on to our vocals. So vocals are the most important thing in your mix, and they're also one of the hardest things to get right, in my opinion. It's very easy to have a vocal that doesn't sound consistent in tone. So it'll either have too much treble or too much low end or too much mid-range. And the goal of a vocal is to get it intelligible and even and consistent. Now, the way that we do that is I use what's called a multi-band compressor. This particular one is Kilohertz Multipass. It comes with the Slate Digital Everything bundle, and it's zero latency, which is really, really useful. Live, I use the Waves C4 or C6 or the F6. Sometimes I'll use Isotope, Neutron, or Ozone. Whatever multi-band compressor you have, or if your DAW has one stock, it'll work. What I like to do is set up 5 bands. I like to take my bands from 150. So these are my crossover points, 150 and below. This is going to be just mud. I don't need this. Plosives are going to live down here. And then I try to take 150 to 400. This is going to be my low mid kind of nastiness. Then from 4 to 1.4, that's going to be kind of my telephony mid range. And then 1.4 to 4.6, that's going to be anything that's harsh. And then 4.6 and above, this is going to help take care of some sibilants and any extreme high end on the S's that I don't want. What I'm going to do is I'm going to put a compressor on each one of these bands, turning it into a multi-band compressor. And what we're going to do is this is key, before we go into our SSL, before we go into our compressors. What I'm going to do is even out the tone of the vocal. So let's get at a level where it feels consistent with everything else. So you can hear it's a live vocal. He's going to kill me if he sees this video, but I'm going to solo out his voice so we can really hear it.
Call the dead man to life. Oh,
So this is
come
raw.
alive, come alive. Yes. Come alive, raise them up. Come.
I do have the auto tuner on because it's pretty much what everybody does these days. Pretty much everything you listen to has auto tune on it. What I'm going to do is
Call the dead man to life.
I'm going to compress these bands. Start with this
Call
one.
the dead man to life. Oh, come alive. Yes.
I'm going to boost my input gain and trim my output gain a little bit just so I got a better signal ratio when working with these thresholds. I'm having to go all the way down. I don't really want to do that, so I want to be able to work kind of in the middle.
Call the dead man to life. Oh, come alive. Yes.
I'm going to crank this low one.
Come alive, raise them up. Come alive. Call the dead man to life, yeah. Call the dead man to life, oh. Come alive, yes. Come alive, raise them up. Come alive. Call the dead man to life, yes. Come alive. Oh, come alive, yes. Come alive.
So if I bypass these compressors, you'll notice it gets a little bit duller. It gets a little bit less intelligible. And when I engage them, it kind of cleans up the signal going into my processing. So I'm not trying to correct tonal differences with my EQ. I'm trying to fit it in the mix with my EQ. When a singer goes for a high note, a lot of times they back off their mic, and so you get a lot less proximity effects, you get a lot less low end, and it gets really harsh. This will take care of that. And then when it's a verse and they get super close to their mic and they sing really low, a lot of times it gets muddy. This will also take care of that going into my SSL.
Call the dead man to life.
Here's with it.
Oh, come alive.
Here's without it.
Come alive. Yes. Come alive. Raise them up. Come alive. Call the dead man to life. Yes. Come alive.
So it sounds much more even with that. So let's place that in our mix.
Call the dead man to life. Oh, come alive.
So you can hear right there, I'll engage and disengage the plugin. When it's disengaged, it's very hard to even hear what he's saying because of how muddy that vocal is. And when I engage it, it's so much more clear.
Call the dead man to life. Oh, come alive. Yeah. Come alive. Raise them up. Come alive.
So let's fit this vocal in. What I'm going to do, I'm still going to process it like I normally would, even though I cut some of the low end and stuff with that multi-band compressor. I'm going to filter out the low end.
Call the dead man to life. Oh, come alive. Yeah. Come alive. Raise them up. Come alive.
I'm going to do some slight compression.
Call the dead man to life. Yes. Come alive. Oh, come alive. Yes. Come alive. Call the dead man to life. Oh, come alive.
So I hear a little bit of muddiness.
Come alive in Jesus' name. Come alive, yes. Call the dead man to life, yeah.
I want to boost some 3K, I think.
Call the dead man to life. Oh, come alive,
So that sounds good. What I'll go into next is a LA2A compressor, and I'll do a good amount of compression on this. This will help to even out the vocal. I like to use an LA2A into an 1176 on my channel, and then an 1176 into an LA2A on my bus. I do 3 to 6 dB of compression on the SSL channel, and then I'll use this next.
Call the dead man to life. Oh, come alive, come alive. Yeah. Come alive, raise them up. Come alive, come alive.
That sounds good to me.
Call the dead man to life. Yes, come alive, come alive.
This kind of helps even it out. And then I'll go into this 1176, and I'll use a fast attack, fast release. For the vocals, it kind of gives a little bit of distortion, which helps it sit.
Call the dead man to life. Oh, come alive, come alive. Yeah. Come alive, raise them up. Come alive, come alive. Call the dead man to life. Yes, come alive, come alive. Oh, come alive, yes. Come alive, come alive. Call the dead man to life. Oh, come alive, come alive.
That's about as much as I would do. I don't want to over compress because I will compress on my bus as well. I want to add a little bit more high end, so I'm just going to do that with my stock EQ in Pro Tools.
Call the dead man to life. Oh, come alive, come alive. Yeah. Come alive, raise them up. Come alive, come alive. Call the dead man to life. Yes, come alive, come alive. Oh, come alive, yes.
That sounds good. And then on my vocal bus, I use an 1176, and I use a slow attack and a fast release. And this kind of gives all of the, this gives a bit more aggression to the compression.
Call the dead man to life. Oh, come alive, yeah. Come alive, raise them up. Come alive. Call the dead man to life. Yes, come alive. Oh, come alive, yes. Come alive.
And again, I go into a LA2A. So stages of compression, multiple stages doing a little bit, is the way that you can get a really, really upfront vocal without it sounding overcompressed. Now on this vocal bus, I end it with an SSL channel, and this is how I fit my vocals into the mix, kind of as a final stage.
Call the dead man to life. Oh, come alive, yeah. Come alive, raise them up. Come alive. Call the dead man to life, yes. Come alive.
So I just cut a little bit of that 400.
Come alive, yes. Come alive. Call the dead man to life. Oh, come alive. Come alive in Jesus' name. Come alive, yes. Call the dead man to life, yeah. Call the dead man to life. Oh, come alive, yeah. Come alive, raise them up. Come alive.
I'm going to try adding some compression.
Call the dead man to life, yes. Come alive.
I like it. I'm going to keep it. From there, I go into a parallel vocal compression. And that is this vocal slam. And I use a UAD 1176, kind of an older model. I'm not even sure. All I know is I really like this particular setting, so it kind of stays on that setting. So this is what, let me put it in pre-fader mode, and this is what that chain actually sounds like. If I mute my my normal vocal bus and just play the parallel. So it's getting all of that sibilance and mouth noise. It's aggressive. It's bright. You hear that distortion? So let me put my vocal bus in and then blend that in.
Call the dead man to life. Oh, come alive, come alive, yeah. Come alive, raise them up. Come alive, come alive.
So that sounds good to me. What I'm going to do real quick is I'm just going to group these guys. I am going to call it my Vox bus, just so that I can turn both of them down a little bit because the level got a little too loud for me.
Call the dead man to life. Oh, come alive, yeah. Come alive, raise them up. Come alive. Call the dead man to life, yes. Come alive. Oh, come alive, yes. Come alive.
That sounds good to me. You'll notice we're good with our master bus. We're not clipping. Our dynamic range is not terrible. If I play it, you'll notice we are good on our headroom. Nothing is sticking out too far. The snare is peaking a little bit more than everything else. So I'm just going to go find which one that is. It's probably the sample because I remember I put up that room mic part of it. Or not the room, just the roomier sample. I turned that up a little bit. So I think that's what's doing it.
Call the dead man to life. Oh, come alive, yeah. Come alive, raise them up. Come alive. Call the dead man to life, yes. Come alive. Oh, come alive, yes. Come alive. Call the dead man to life. Oh, come alive.
So that seems to have done it a little bit better. I'm going to do a little bit more compression
Call
on
the
it.
dead man to life. Oh, come alive, yeah.
Something that works really well, I'm going to take a little bit more of the lows off.
Call the dead man to life. Oh, come alive, yeah. Come alive, raise them up.
So that seems to have done it. It's no longer peaking more than everything else. I am going to add some compression on my sample to try and bring out a little bit of that room. I'm going to use the Slate Digital Virtual Mix Rack for that. I highly recommend this plugin. It has everything you need, and everything that I'm using from other manufacturers is pretty much in this plugin anyway. You've got all these different modules. I'm going to use their FG Stress, which is a distressor model, and their API EQ. And so I'm going to turn this off for now, and I'm going to put this in default, and let's see what we are doing as far as gain reduction on our snare.
Call the dead man to life. Oh, come alive, yeah. Come alive, raise them up. Come alive. Call the dead man to life, yes. Come alive. Oh, come alive, yes. Come alive. Call the dead man to life. Oh, come alive.
So I just played with it a little. I made the attack a little slow, the release really fast. That way I'm getting the punch from it. And then I sped up the attack a little bit so that it wasn't too punchy. And then what I'm going to do from there is I'm going to trim it because I made it louder. And then I'm going to add a little bit more high end with this API 20 kilohertz band, which is phenomenal sounding.
Call the dead man to life. Oh, come alive, come alive, yeah. Come alive, raise them up. Come alive, come alive. Call the dead man to life, yes. Come alive, come alive. Oh, come alive, yes. Come alive. Call the dead man to life. Oh, come alive, come alive.
And from there, I'm actually going to put a little bit of distortion on it because just like the bass, distortion helps.
Call the dead man to life. Oh, come alive, yeah. Call the dead man to life. Oh, come alive, yeah. Come alive, raise them up. Come alive. Call the dead man to life, yes. Come alive. Oh, come alive, yes. Come alive. Call the
So that sounds good to me. That sounds a bit more balanced. And let's see where we're sitting at with our master bus.
Call the dead man to life. Oh, come alive, yeah. Come alive, raise them up. Come alive. Call the dead.
So we are still hitting that a little bit hotter than I want to on the snare. I'm going to pull down the kick and snare bus a little bit. I'm just going to pull down this snare drum.
Call the dead man to life. Oh, come alive, yeah.
Sounds better.
Come on.
A little bit of level jump is not bad on that section because it gets louder. I just don't want the snare to get louder than everything else when it starts getting aggressive. All right, so from there, let's move on to some effects, and then we'll blend in our background vocal and then our room mic, and then we'll do some mastering. So for effects, I've got my vocal soloed, and I use 4 effects. Like I said at the beginning, I use a short reverb, a long reverb, a chorus, and a delay. So here's the short reverb.
Call the dead man to life. Oh,
Here's the long reverb.
call the dead man to life. Oh, come alive, yes. Come on.
Both of those are the Soundtoys little plate, just set to different decay times. This one's got some low cut and modulation. Every single effect that I use is filtered with this EQ, so it's got a low pass, a high pass, and a dip in the low mids. That helps keep my effects from having to reproduce any frequencies that don't sound good anyway, that I don't want in the effects return. And it saves me from having to EQ my effects returns after. So let's hear the chorus.
Call the dead man to life. Oh, come alive.
Sounds like that. It just adds a little bit
Come on.
of interest, a little bit of modulation to the vocal, a little bit of width. And then this is the fun one. This is the delay.
Call the dead man to life. Oh, come alive, yes. Come alive, raise them up. Come alive. Call.
So it's really crazy sounding. It's not like a quarter note delay where it's repeating the words. It's just adding almost a rushed feeling, which translates to energy when you blend it in the mix. So that's an eighth note dotted and a quarter note triplet together. Here's what all the effects sound like when you put them together. So here is all of them.
Call the dead man to life. Oh, come alive, yes. Come alive, raise them up.
So you can hear it kind of is just this swirly thing happening underneath of his vocal. Here's what they sound like in the mix.
Call the dead man to life. Oh, come alive, yeah. Come alive, raise them up. Come alive.
So I will mute them and unmute them. So here's muted.
Call the dead man to life. Oh, come alive, yeah. Come alive, raise them up. Come alive. Call the dead man to life, yes. Come alive. Oh, come alive, yes.
So it just adds a little bit of depth to everything. Now let's add some reverb to this snare as well. I usually use the same short plate that I use for my vocals. And I'll put it on the toms and the overheads as well. So let me mute it and unmute it. Just adds a little bit of depth. I'm not looking for too much.
Call the dead man to life. Oh, come alive, yeah. Come alive, raise them up. Come alive.
Just kind of helps sit it behind everything a little bit, gives it a little bit more space. So let's move to our background vocal. First thing I'm going to do is just copy the multiband compressor that we have. I'm going to copy the EQ. I'm going to just copy, and start from there. Here's what she sounds like. So here's a great example of something that you'll probably encounter. So she is currently worshiping and is not at her mic. So you can hear how much bleed there is from our stage. So I'm going to gate this mic heavily. And let's find a section where she is singing. So here's a section where she is singing.
We need your presence, your king.
So it sounds pretty good with the same settings. It's a background vocal, so we're just going to blend it in underneath of the main vocal. And I will also copy the chorus as well as the short room. I don't want the big reverb or the big delay because I don't want to draw attention to the background vocal over the lead vocal. I want the lead vocal to have kind of all the moments and the background vocal be there to kind of support it. So let's blend this in.
We need your presence. Your kingdom come, your will be done, here as in heaven. Spirit of God, fall fresh on us. We need your oh, we're asking you to come, Lord. Your kingdom come, your will be done, here as in heaven.
So I just pulled out a little bit of low end on her vocal and I fitted it into where I thought it sounded good. And that's pretty much what I'll do for background vocals. I will usually use what my lead vocal is as a starting point and then adjust from there. And cutting low end can help a background vocal sit because they sound further away the less low end that they have. So let's move on to this room mic. This is an AR mic. We've got two of them in our sanctuary. They sound like this. So the first thing you're going to want to do on these mics is filter out the lows. I'm going to compress it. I'm going to compress it with a high ratio. I don't want it to kind of get louder as the band gets louder. I'm trying to grab the congregation at 1.7, and then I'm going to cut a little bit of the nasty kind of mid-range. So they're singing hard. They sound wonderful. So let's blend that guy in.
We need your
We need your presence. Your kingdom come, your will be done. Here as in heaven. Spirit of God, Spirit of God, fall fresh on us. We need your oh, we're asking you to come, Lord. Your kingdom come, your will be done, here as in heaven.
So that sounds pretty good. I'm going to leave it there. And that is the bulk of the mix kind of done, kind of figured out. And again, this is just that big section that we've kind of been working on. You'll want to automate things and listen to the whole thing, kind of make sure everything's fitting for the most part throughout the song. So let's take it back a couple clicks.
Flow in this place, fill our hearts with your love. Your love surrounds us. You're the reason we came to encounter your love. Your love surrounds, overflow, Lord, overflow in this place. Fill our hearts with your love. Your love surrounds us. You're the reason we came to encounter your love. Your love surrounds. Come on, lift it up. We sing overflow. Overflow in this place. Fill our hearts with your love. Your love surrounds us. You're the reason we came.
So I'm still hearing a little bit of a low buildup on his vocal.
In this place, fill our hearts with your love. Your love surrounds us. You're the reason we came to encounter your love. Your love surrounds, overflow, Lord.
So I'll leave that there. It sounds pretty good. And we can move on to some final mix kind of bus processing. So let's take it from this cool little vocal moment that we've been working on.
Okay, one more thing.
Where is that moment? I think it's right here.
Man to life.
Part.
We sing come alive, come alive, come alive. Come alive, come alive.
So for your mix bus, you're going to want to use some compression on it. And I like this SSL comp with slowest attack, fastest release, and I try to aim for about 2 to 3 dB of reduction.
Man to life. We sing come alive, come alive, come alive. Come alive, come alive. Come alive, come alive. Call the dead man to life. Oh, come alive, come alive.
And that makes the whole mix kind of feel like it works together.
Raise them up, come alive, come alive. Call the dead man to life, yes. Come alive, come alive. Oh, come alive, yes. Come alive, come alive. Call the dead man to life. Oh, come alive, come alive. Come alive in Jesus' name. Come alive, yeah.
So it feels like it's glued together a bit more with that. I am also using the Slate Digital virtual mix rack for this virtual mix bus. It's currently set to kind of emulate the summing characteristics of a SSL 4000 console, which, if you remember, is the channel strip that I'm using. This kind of helps with the master bus. I'll switch through a couple of these settings. So maybe the API, which is this USA console emulation, maybe that sounds better since this is super mid-rangey.
Man to life. We sing come alive, come alive, come alive. Come alive, come alive. Come alive, come alive. Call the dead man to life. Oh, come alive, yeah. Come alive, raise them up. Come alive, call the dead man to life, yes. Come alive, oh, come alive, yes. Come alive, call the dead man to life. Oh, come alive in Jesus' name. Come alive, yes. Call the dead man to life, yeah. There is freedom in your name.
So I'm going to leave it on this Trident setting. I think it kind of brightens everything up in a nice way. You can experiment with that plugin. It's great. I'm just going to double check my compression again and make sure that it didn't make it go into too much compression.
Man to life. We sing come alive, come alive, come alive. Come alive, come alive. Come alive, come alive. Call the dead man to life. Oh, come alive, yeah.
So it sounds good. You can really see that compressor's kind of holding things back the whole time, very slightly. And what that does is kind of just, it folds the mix together in a really nice way, and it holds it so that it's not too dynamic. It's not getting louder and softer. It's kind of staying in one place. We still have dynamic range, but it's controlling that a little bit more and making that dynamic range ever so smaller. Once again, we're going into that Pultec EQ that we did before. I think that sounds good. And then I'm going into a virtual tape emulator from Slate Digital. I just mix through this no matter what I'm working on. It just makes everything sound better. Here's without it.
Man to life. We sing come alive, come alive, come alive.
Here's with it.
Come alive, come alive. Come alive, come alive. Call the dead man to life. Oh, come alive.
So it adds kind of a low mid bump that sounds really, really nice. It does add a little bit of level, but it just sounds good. So that is the mix. It sounds pretty good to my ears on these headphones that I'm mixing on. I'm going to do a quick comparison of what we've done versus what we started with. So here is what we started with. Remember, it's all kind of nasty gain stage and whatnot. here's what we turned it into using just a couple plugins and some basic EQ and compression. Let me unmute these parallel buses.
We sing come alive, come alive, come alive. Come alive, come alive. Come alive, come alive. Call the dead man to life. Oh, come alive, come alive.
And to show you the importance of the buses kind of holding everything together, I'm going to get rid of my parallel kick snare, parallel drum compression, and my parallel vocals, and I'm also going to disable all the compression on them. And here's with all the compression and the parallel kick snare, parallel drum slam, and the parallel vocal slam.
We sing come alive, come alive, come alive. Come alive, come alive.
And I might put the vocals down a little bit.
We sing come alive, come alive, come alive.
Sounds a little better.
Come alive, come alive. Come alive, come alive. Call the dead man to life. Oh, come alive, come alive. Yeah. Come alive, come alive.
And so for some basic mastering, what we can do is, before we do that, let's check our tonal balance control. This is a plugin from iZotope. I leave it on the bass heavy setting. It feels like it's the most accurate, at least for the way I mix. Let's just see frequency-wise, are we in target or are we completely somewhere where we shouldn't be?
Man to life. We sing come alive, come alive, come alive. Come alive.
So we're good. Everything looks in target. Might need a little bit more high end, but that's pretty typical for mastering. So what we're going to do is, I would much rather get my high end from a high shelf on my mix bus than from my individual elements just all being really bright. I think you get a more cohesive sound that way. So let's open up iZotope Ozone, which is what a lot of people use to just kind of do a quick mastering style processing of their mix. And so let's give it a little bit of a high shelf.
Man to life. We sing come alive, come alive, come alive. Come alive, come alive.
Let's try 3 dB before and after.
Man to life. We sing come alive, come alive, come alive. Come alive, come alive. Come alive.
I want a little bit more bite out of the guitars, so I'm going to go into mid-side. Actually, yeah, I'm going to go into mid-side. And I'm going to go to my sides. I'm going to solo my sides. I'm going to find where the bite of the guitars is, and I'm going to boost it only there. Let's see what that sounds like.
Man to life. We sing come alive, come alive, come alive. Come alive, come alive. Come alive, come alive. Call the dead man to life. Oh, come alive, come alive. Yeah. Come alive, come alive. Raise them up. Come alive, come alive. Call the dead man to life. Yes. Come alive, come alive. Oh, come alive, come alive. Yes. Come alive, come alive.
So that sounds good to my ears. Let's go into some compression. What I like to do on my master is use a multi-band compressor. I like the way it's set up stock. And I will link all my bands and bring them down until I start to see some compression. It's usually on this low mid one because it's the widest. And then from there, I might tweak the other ones.
Man to life. We sing come alive, come alive, come alive. Come alive, come alive. Come alive, come alive. Call the dead man to life. Oh, come alive, come alive. Yeah. Come
not going to add makeup gain. I'm not trying to add level yet. All I'm trying to do is just kind of control the frequency spectrum a little bit, and it sounds like it worked. And now I will add some level with this guy. I like to use the vintage limiter that they have. It sounds a little better to me. I'll use it on the modern setting. I think it adds some saturation. I love distortion. You can probably tell that, but I love distortion. So I'll set my ceiling to about -7 or -0.7. That's nice and loud. We're at about -8 on our RMS level. And if we go into our LUFS, we can see where we are in terms of loudness. And we can also open up tonal balance control again, see after all that mastering, what do we look like. So it looks good. This is not a studio recording, so there is not going to be as much high end. But that looks pretty flat, looks pretty good. And then on our Insight plugin, we are at a nice -12 for our LUFS. That's plenty loud for most broadcasts. It's louder than most broadcast standards, and for most music mixes, that is plenty loud. The nice thing about how we've kind of controlled our dynamic range throughout the mix is we could push this much louder. I am not even hitting my my limiter at all in terms of gain reduction. So you'll notice right here, it'll show you how many dB of gain reduction you're doing. I'm currently doing no dBs of gain reduction. I'm just turning my mix up with some saturation in this limiter. Because we've done such a good job of controlling our dynamic range, nothing is jumping out and hitting our limiter and causing our mix to compress. So as we gain level, it still sounds huge. And then no matter what level you play it back at, it will still sound huge. So even if YouTube turns down your mix or Spotify turns down your mix, it's still a huge sounding mix because it's not squashed. So let's get some more level and let's see if we can, how loud we can get this integrated LUFS up, or down, I should say, because down is up in terms of the level. Let's see how loud we can get this before we're really squashing it. So we're doing 2 dB of gain reduction on the peaks. That's way too limited. I turned the true peak limiter on so that we're not actually clipping our converters. You'd want to do that in mastering. But I'm going to bring that back down because that sounds bad. But we're able to get -8 on our LUFS, which is stinking loud. That's louder than a lot of commercial records, and if not as loud as a lot of commercial records. And this is a live worship performance. So if you mix it well and you mix the dynamic range well, you can get a loud mix. You shouldn't have a problem with that. Let's bring this back down and get it back to -12. So now we're at -10 and we're still doing no gain reduction on our limiter. So let's leave it there. That's nice and loud. That should be huge sounding for any delivery platform that you send it to. All right, guys, that concludes the worship mixdown video. If you found this video helpful, I'm super, super glad. write a comment if you have any questions or anything. I'll try to get back to whoever I can. And I hope this was helpful for you as I kind of tried to break down my process for mixing a worship set.